We'll continue reading from the IRS Code 26, Section 3401. 19. For any benefit provided to or on behalf of an employee, if at the time such benefit is provided, it is reasonable to believe that the employee will be able to exclude such benefit from income under Section 74C, 108F4, 117, or 132. 20. For any medical care reimbursement made to or for the benefit of an employee under a self-insured medical reimbursement plan within the meaning of Section 105H6. 21. For any payment made to or for the benefit of an employee if at the time of such payment it is reasonable to believe that the employee will be able to exclude such payment from income under Section 106B. 22. Any payment made to or for the benefit of an employee if at the time of such payment it is reasonable to believe that the employee will be able to exclude such payment from income under Section 106D, or 23. For any benefit or payment which is excludable from the gross income of the employee under Section 139B. The term wages includes any amount includable in gross income of an employee under Section 409A, and payment of such amount shall be treated as having been made in the taxable year in which the amount is so includable. B. Payroll period. For purposes of this chapter, the term payroll period means a period for which a payment of wages is ordinarily made to the employee by his employer, and the term miscellaneous payroll period means a payroll period other than a daily, weekly, bi-weekly, semi-monthly, monthly, quarterly, semi-annual, or annual payroll period. C. Employee. For purposes of this chapter, the term employee includes an officer, employee, or elected official of the United States, a state, or a political subdivision thereof, or the District of Columbia, or any agency or instrumentality of any one or more of the foregoing. The term employee also includes an officer of a corporation. D. Employer. For purposes of this chapter, the term employer means the person for whom an individual performs or performed any service of whatever nature as the employee of such person, except that 1. If the person for whom the individual performs or performed the service does not have control of the payment of the wages for such services, the term employer, except for purposes of subsection A, means the person having control of the payment of such wages. And 2, in the case of a person paying wages on behalf of a non-resident alien individual, foreign partnership, or foreign corporation not engaged in trade or business within the United States, the term employer, except for purposes of subsection A, means such person. F. Tips. For purposes of subsection A, the term wages includes tips received by an employee in the course of his employment. Such wages shall be deemed to be paid at the time of a written statement, including such tips, is furnished to the employer pursuant to Section 6053A, or, if no statement including such tips is so furnished, at the time received. G. Crew leader rules to apply. Rules similar to the rules of Section 3121O shall apply for the purposes of this chapter. H. Differential wage payments to active duty members of the uniformed services. 1. In general, for purposes of subsection A, Any differential wage payment shall be treated as a payment of wages by the employer to the employee. Differential wage payment. For purposes of this paragraph, 1. The term differential wage payment means any payment which a. is made by an employer to an individual with respect to any period during which the individual is performing services in the Uniform Services as defined in Chapter 43 of Title 38 United States Code, while on active duty for a period of more than 30 days, and b. represents all or a portion of the wages to the individual would have received from the employer if the individual were performing services for the employer. I. Qualified stock for which an election is in effect under Section 83I. For purposes of subsection A, qualified stock, as defined in Section 83I, with respect to which an election is made under Section 83I, shall be treated as wages. 1. Received on the earliest date described in Section 83I 1B, and 2. In an amount equal to the amount included in income under Section 83 for which the taxable year which includes such date. Title 26 of the U.S. Code, Section 3402, Income Tax Collected at Source. A. Requirement of withholding. 1. In general, except as otherwise provided in this section, every employer making payment of wages shall deduct and withhold upon such wages a tax determined in accordance with tables or computational procedures prescribed by the Secretary. Any tables or procedures prescribed under this paragraph shall a. apply with respect to the amount of wages paid during such periods as the Secretary may prescribe, and b. in such form and provide for such amounts to be deducted and withheld as the Secretary determines to be most appropriate to carry out the purposes of this chapter and to reflect the provisions of Chapter 1 applicable to such periods. 2. Amount of wages. For purposes of applying tables or procedures prescribed under paragraph 1, the term the amount of wages means the amount by which the wages exceed the taxpayer's withholding allowance, prorated to the payroll period. B. Percentage method of withholding. If wages are paid with respect to a period which is not a payroll period, the withholding allowance allowable with respect to each payment of such wages shall be the allowance allowed for a miscellaneous payroll period, containing a number of days, including Sunday and holidays, equal to the number of days in the period with respect to which such wages are paid. 2. In any case in which wages are paid by an employer without regard to any payroll period or other period, the withholding allowance allowable with respect to each payment of such wages shall be the allowance allowed for a miscellaneous payroll period, containing a number of days equal to the number of days, including Sunday and holidays, which have elapsed since the date of the last payment of such wages by such employer during the calendar year, or the date of commencement of employment with such employer during such year, or January 1 of such year, whichever is the latter. 3. In any case in which the period or time described in paragraph 2 in respect of any wages is less than 1 week, the Secretary, under regulations prescribed by him, may authorize an employer to compute the tax to be deducted and withheld as if the aggregate of the wages paid to the employee during the calendar week were paid for a weekly payroll period. 4. In determining the amount to be deducted and withheld under this subsection, the wages may, at the election of the employer, be computed to the nearest dollar. C. Wage bracket withholding. 1. At the election of the employer with respect to any employee, the employer shall deduct and withhold upon the wages paid to such an employee a tax, in lieu of the tax required to be deducted and withheld under subsection A, determined in accordance with tables prescribed by the Secretary in accordance with paragraph 6. 2. If wages are paid with respect to a period which is not a payroll period, the amount to be deducted and withheld shall be that applicable in the case of a miscellaneous payroll period, containing a number of days, including Sunday and holidays, equal to the number of days in the period with respect to which such wages are paid. 3. In any case in which wages are paid by an employer without regard to any payroll period or other period, the amount to be deducted and withheld shall be that applicable in the case of a miscellaneous payroll period, containing a number of days equal to the number of days, including Sundays and holidays, which have elapsed since the date of the last payment of such wages by such employer during the calendar year, or the date of commencement of employment with such employer during such year, or January 1 of such year, whichever is later. 4. In any case in which the period, or the time described in paragraph 3, in respect of any wages is less than 1 week, the Secretary, under regulations prescribed by him, may authorize an employer to determine the amount to be deducted and withheld under the tables applicable in the case of a weekly payroll period, in which case the aggregate of the wages paid to the employee during the calendar week shall be considered weekly wages. 5. If the wages exceed the highest wage bracket, in determining amount to be deducted and withheld under this subsection, the wages may, at the election of the employer, be computed to the nearest dollar. 6. In the case of wages paid after December 31st, 1969, the amount deducted and withheld under paragraph 1 shall be determined in accordance with tables prescribed by the Secretary. In the table so prescribed, the amount set forth as wages and amounts of income tax to be deducted and withheld shall be computed on the basis of the table for an annual payroll period prescribed pursuant to subsection A. D. Tax paid by recipient. If the employer, in violation of the provisions of this chapter, fails to deduct and withhold the tax under this chapter, and therefore the tax against which such tax may be credited is paid, the tax so required to be deducted and withheld shall not be collected from the employer, but this subsection shall in no case relieve the employer from liability for any penalties or addition to the tax otherwise applicable in respect of such failure to deduct and withhold. E. Included and excluded wages. If the remuneration paid by an employer to an employee for services performed during 1/2 or more of any payroll period of not more than 31 consecutive days constitutes wages, all the remuneration paid by such employer to such employee for such period shall be deemed to be wages. But if the remuneration paid by an employer to an employee for services performed during more than 1/2 of any such payroll period does not constitute wages, then none of the remuneration paid by such employer to such employee for such period shall be deemed to be wages. F. Withholding allowance. 1. In general, under rules determined by the Secretary, an employee receiving wages shall on any day be entitled to a withholding allowance determined based on A. Whether the employee is an individual for whom a deduction is allowable with respect to another taxpayer under Section 151. B. If the employee is married, whether the employee's spouse is entitled to an allowance or would be so entitled if such spouse were an employee receiving wages, under subparagraph A or D, but only if such spouse does not have in effect a withholding allowance certificate claiming such allowance. C. The number of individuals with respect to whom, on the basis of facts existing at the beginning of such day, there may reasonably be expected to be allowable a credit under Section 24A for the taxable year under Subtitle A, in respect of which amounts deducted and withheld under this chapter in the calendar year in which such day falls are allowed as a credit. D. Any additional amounts to which the employee elects to take into account under subsection M, but only if the employee's spouse does not have in effect a withholding allowance certificate making such an election. E. The standard deduction allowable to such employee, 1/2 of such standard deduction in the case of an employee who is married, as determined under Section 7703, and whose spouse is an employee receiving wages subject to withholding, and F. Whether the employee has withholding allowance certificates in effect with respect to more than one employer. Two, allowance certificates. A. On commencement of employment. On or before the date of the commencement of employment with an employer, the employee shall furnish the employer with a signed allowance certificate relating to the withholding allowance claimed by the employee, which shall in no event exceed the amount to which the employee is entitled. B. Change of status. If, on any day during the calendar year, an employee's withholding allowance is in excess of the withholding allowance to which the employee would be entitled, had the employee submitted a true and accurate withholding allowance certificate to the employer on that day, the employer shall, within 10 days thereafter, furnish the employer with a new withholding allowance certificate. If, on any day during the calendar year, an employee's withholding allowance is greater than the withholding allowance claimed, the employee may furnish the employer with a new withholding allowance certificate relating to the withholding allowance to which the employee is so entitled, which shall in no event exceed the amount to which the employee is entitled on such day. C. Change of status which affects next calendar year. If on any day during the calendar year, the withholding allowance to which the employee will be, or may reasonably be expected to be, entitled at the beginning of the employee's next taxable year under Subtitle A, is different from the allowance to which the employee is entitled on such day, the employee shall, in such cases, and at such time as the Secretary shall by regulations prescribe, furnish the employer with a withholding allowance certificate relating to the withholding allowance to which the employee claims with respect to such next taxable year, which shall in no event exceed the withholding allowance to which the employee will be, or may reasonably be expected to be, so entitled. 3. When certificate takes effect. A. First certificate furnished. A withholding allowance certificate is furnished the employer in cases in which no previous such certificate is in effect, shall take effect as of the beginning of the first payroll period ending, or the first payment of wages made without regard to a payroll period, on or after the date on which such certificate is so furnished. B. Furnished to take place of existing certificate. I. In general, except as provided in clauses 2 and 3, a withholding allowance certificate furnished to the employer, in cases in which a previous such certificate is in effect, shall take effect as of the beginning of the first payroll period ending, or the first payment of wages without regard to a payroll period, on or after the 30th day after the day on which such certificate is so furnished. 2. Employer may elect earlier effective date. At the election of the employer, a certificate described in Clause 1 may be effective beginning with any payment of wages made on or after the day on which the certificate is so furnished, and before the 30th day referred to in Clause 1. 3. Change of status which affects new year. Any certificate furnished pursuant to paragraph 2C shall not take effect and may not be made effective with respect to any payment of wages made in the calendar year in which the certificate is furnished. Any certificate furnished pursuant to paragraph 2C shall not take effect and may not be made effective with respect to any payment of wages made in the calendar year in which the certificate is furnished.